Hi everyone, and welcome to the Theological Foundations class. My name is Brad, and this is the first video from week 1. And in this video, we're going to address the question, what is theology? First, the definition of the word theology. The word theology comes from two ancient Greek words found in the Bible. We get the ology part of theology from the word logos, which has the meaning word, idea, reasoned discourse. And the second word is theos, which means God. Therefore, the word theology means a reasoned discourse about God. It's the study of God and the things of God. Now, I want you to get much more than just the definition of the word theology. I want us to have an understanding of the concept of theology and an appreciation for what makes truly faithful Christian theology. So I'm going to start by contrasting good Christian theology with a few things that are sometimes called theology, but are not really what we're aiming for. First, theology is not mythology. Let me explain what I mean. Ask yourself, well, how can we know about God? And there's two general approaches. First is sometimes called theology from below. That is, we start from our reason, our experiences, human nature, and from this we think, well, what must God be like? And we determine, well, God must be like this, or God can't be like that. Sometimes we might come up with conclusions that are true in part, but this approach is not theology as we want to learn it in this class. You see, the speculation of human wisdom about what God is like, trying to figure out God without listening to God, it cannot really give us reliable information about God, but really only tells us about ourselves or the people who are taking this approach. So I want to warn you against this approach to theological thinking. This is actually what Paul calls hollow and deceptive philosophy, which depends on human tradition and the basic principles of this world rather than on Christ. And Jesus also warns against this approach when he said, "These people honor me with their lips, but their hearts are far from me. They worship me in vain. Their teachings are but rules taught by men. You have let go of the commands of God and are holding on to the traditions of men." And Paul again, he says, "Do not deceive yourselves. If any of you thinks he is wise by the standards of this age, he should become a fool, so that he may become wise. For the wisdom of this world is foolishness in God's sight. The Lord knows that the thoughts of the wise are futile." You see, the natural bent of all of us is to trust ourselves, our own ideas and opinions. But the track record of this kind of theology is uniformly bad. And God is smarter than we are. And we should value His insight above our own. In doing theology, we must always be asking, does this come from God, or is it just a good idea from myself or from other people? You see, there's an infinite difference between humanity and God, and there's no possible way we can figure God out. If we start with ourselves, we just cannot know about God's nature. And every attempt to get from us to God goes dramatically wrong. Any God talk without revelation from God is weak human wisdom at best, and it's utter foolishness at worst. Therefore, we need to take the second approach. This is often called theology from above. That is, God Himself has to reveal Himself, to tell us about Himself. And then we hear, understand, believe, and apply what He has first revealed. So we start with the biblical assumptions that God does exist and that He has spoken and acted in history. And He has caused an authoritative record of His words and actions to be preserved for us as the primary means by which He is to be known. Then God can be known, and we can be confident in the truth and accuracy of this knowledge because it comes from God Himself. And by the way, if this is true, then to ignore God's chosen means of revealing Himself and to substitute our own opinions, that's arrogance and sin. True Christian theology concentrates on the truth revealed by God more than our ideas about God. What I want you to get from this distinction between mythology and theology: mythology is the human attempt to describe the world and spiritual realities starting from our own understanding. But theology is learning, understanding, embracing, applying, and communicating truth that did not originate with us, but comes to us from God. There's a strong contrast in the Bible between human wisdom and God's wisdom. Unless it comes from God, it's relatively useless to bridge the gulf between us and God, because God is different from us. To project our own thoughts onto God and call it theology is delusion. So there's two choices. Either our own ideas projected onto God and we call it theology, or God comes to us in the incarnation and revelation from God's side. There's a huge difference between revealed doctrine and human speculation. So I want us to understand theology as our interaction with God's revelation, as opposed to merely human speculation. Therefore, in theology, faithfulness is more important than creativity. Our goal is not to say something new and novel, but to say something that is accurate and faithful to what God has said. We listen more than we talk because God is smarter than we are. We don't make up theology, but we receive theology. Theology is not just human ideas, but it's truth from God. Now, the second contrast I want to make is to contrast theology with thought that is disconnected from life. That is, theology is not compartmentalized. It's not isolated by itself. Theology avoids the two extremes of anti-intellectualism and mere intellectualism. Let me explain. Anti-intellectualism is the mindset that we don't need to think about the things of God. We just go by feelings or some sort of intuition. And it's fairly clear by the definition of the word theology that theology involves thinking. So people who fall into anti-intellectualism usually are not trying to do theology, but rather are avoiding or rejecting theology as something that they think is undesirable or unnecessary. We'll address anti-intellectualism a little bit more in the next video when we ask the question why we need to do theology. But for now, please understand that theology can't be separated from thinking. However, there's an error at the other extreme that I want to address as well. And that's the error of mere intellectualism. Mere intellectualism is the idea that theology is just thinking about the things of God. The problem with this is the idea that thinking is all we need. We do need thinking about God, and that's a large part of what theology does. But theology is more than just thinking about God. We also need passion for God, obedience, and action for God. If we only sit around and think about it, it's not faithful Christian theology. It's just an interesting mind game. Theology that is not lived out is not good theology. Jesus compared this approach to a man who built his house on the sand and had some very bad results. Some people think that an intellectual faith is a sin, but an intellectual faith is not a sin. It's a virtue. It's the two extremes that are the problem. An anti-intellectual faith is a sin because God has chosen to reveal himself through truth written in a book that addresses our intellect. And mere intellectual faith is also a sin because God has given his truth to be loved and acted upon. Therefore, we need to connect our theological thinking to all of our life. Jesus commanded us to love the Lord your God with all of our heart, soul, mind, and strength. And we don't get to choose which parts of us love God and which don't. We can't disconnect any part of theology from any other part of it, or it ceases to be good theology. Good theology is neither anti-intellectual or merely intellectual. And the last contrast I want to make is with man-centered, self-centered thinking. Because theology is not primarily about us. Theology can address any topic, but it does it from a God-centered perspective. Theology addresses questions and answers that focus primarily on God. It must be God-centered or it's not theology. Remember, the word is theology, not meology. God must be the main point of reference for all of our theology. Let me try and illustrate. It's not thinking about my life or my world and then somehow trying to fit God into it. Rather, it's to realize that everything is from God and through God and to God. And we learn how everything is created for His glory and only finds its meaning in Him. We turn our attention away from ourselves and onto God. Like I said, theology can and does talk about every subject, but it does it with God as the ultimate reference point. We first see God, and then we see everything else more clearly. Let me give you a couple examples. We don't just talk about politics, for instance. We start with talking about how God is king, how He rules the world, sometimes through human agents. And we think carefully about what He has told us about His ideals for human governments. And then from that perspective, we can work through the implications for how we live and vote and act as citizens, etc. Another example, we don't just talk about ethics in terms of what we should or should not do, what makes us happy, what benefits us. We start by talking about God's character and God's purposes for humanity. And we think about what He has said is right and what is wrong. And then from that perspective, we can work through all the implications for all of our ethical decisions. One more example. We don't talk about church primarily in terms of our human activities. We start by talking about how the church is God's creation, how God is building His church. We think about what He says is the nature and mission of the church. And then, from that perspective, we can work through all the implications for our activities and how we participate in His church. That doesn't mean that there's no place for humanity in theology. No, not at all. But rather it puts us humans in the proper place. And we're not first. God is first. Don't ask God to be a part of what you're doing. Rather, ask to be a part of what God is doing. See, God is Lord and King of the universe, and you and I, we are not. Any theology that denies or ignores this viewpoint is not good theology. Good theology is directly opposed to the idea that mankind is the measure of all things. Good theology will teach us and challenge us that you and I were not the center of the universe. And until we get this, we will never be sane. Good theology looks at God more than it looks in a mirror. Of course, it's legitimate to come to theology with our own questions and curiosities on every subject, including our own life. But ultimately, good theology will help us to center on the questions and issues that God tells us are the most important issues. It helps us to keep the main thing the main thing. Now that I've ranted and we've talked about some things that theology is not, I think we're better able to understand what theology is. Let me give this definition. True Christian theology, as we'll be using the term in this class, is receiving, embracing, deeply understanding, applying, and communicating revelation from God. Let me break it down. First, theology is receiving God's revelation. We hear, read, somehow come into contact with the truth of the Scripture. At first, it can be accidental or haphazard. Maybe a friend tells us about Jesus. But as we mature, it should be more intentional. We seek out the truth for ourselves. Second, theology is replicating, recreating God's revelation in our own mind and heart. We think God's thoughts after Him. As much as it's possible for our limited human minds, we come to an understanding of what God has communicated. We think what God thinks. We know what God knows. We reproduce God's mindset in our own mind. We agree with God on every subject. We think about God and all things as related to God. In theology, we concentrate on God, and we also think with God. God is active participant in our theology. God is involved and the primary contributor to the conversation. And good theology involves God in the process. And we think God's thoughts after Him. God is first, and we conform our minds to His truth. When we come to something that we don't yet know, or when we're confronted with something with which we disagree, we could ask God to change, that He would be more like we want Him to be. Good luck with that. Or we could trust that He is greater and wiser than we are. And we could listen to what He has to say and then change our mind to match God's mind. In doing so, we learn, we grow, we mature and become more wise. And finally, we think clearly, we think systematically. Because God's truth is clear, it's consistent and not haphazard. Even though sometimes it is complex and nuanced, but it's still clear. Therefore, our thinking needs to be consistent and organized as well. Good theology is like a map that helps us see the whole truth and how each part fits together. When we replicate God's thoughts in our thoughts, we know God more and more. Not just knowing about God. If you only know facts about God but don't engage with God, you're not doing theology. But it's not less than knowing about God. If you only have experiences and feelings towards God but don't know anything about Him, you're not doing theology either. We can't separate knowing about God from knowing God. We need both. Never try to separate the truth of God from God Himself. Can you imagine claiming to know somebody but not knowing their name, what they look like, what they act like, etc.? Unless you know things about them, you don't really know them. And one of the primary ways to know people is to better know more things about them. I want to be careful. I'm not saying that you can know someone just by looking up facts about them. But I'm saying that truly getting to know someone includes knowing their facts, their attitudes, their likes, their dislikes, etc. You can't really know someone without also knowing things about them. And the same with God. When we replicate God's thoughts in our minds, we come to an understanding of what He knows. Of course, in part, He'll always know a lot more than we'll ever be able to. But we don't just gain new facts, we also gain new attitudes and passions. We love the things that He loves. We hate the things that He hates. And we respond in the same ways that He responds to various parts of our life. We conform all of our minds and hearts to His. Then theology is responding to God's revelation. When we replicate God's truth, it changes us. Romans 12:2 commands us to be transformed by the renewing of our minds. This partly happens automatically by the working of God's Spirit when we hear and receive His Word with faith, but it partly happens when we are purposely obedient to what we've learned. God does His part, and we need to do our part. We need to keep the theory and practice of theology together. Just like you can't separate knowing someone from knowing about them, we can't separate the theoretical from the practical. Bad theology does not practice what it believes, and Jesus calls this hypocrisy. And bad theology doesn't recognize that sometimes they're hidden assumptions, or it's naive about the underlying theory that's really driving. Sometimes people don't realize that their practice is driven by some underlying assumptions that they haven't yet examined, so they don't yet know if they're good assumptions or bad. Everyone has a worldview, a theology that drives their practice. The question is it a healthy worldview or not? Therefore, it needs to be examined. And bad theology is incomplete theology that has not yet done the thought, the work, the repentance and prayer to make the connection between what is true and what difference it makes in our life. And I want to encourage you not to fall into these traps that will separate theory from practice. It's not always easy to make the connection between truth and life, but it is worth it. And that's the task of theology. And I hope and pray that you'll find the deep, soul-satisfying joy that comes from knowing the truth and living your life in conformity with the truth of who God is. Because good theology holds together theory and practice. It includes obeying God, responding to God by applying His truth to all of life. And finally, theology is retelling God's revelation. It's communicating and proclaiming God and His truth. It's doing the work to communicate in a way that's appropriate to whoever is listening and connects with their situation and their context. And it's communicating in a manner so that they too can receive, replicate, respond, and retell God's revelation in a way that's faithful both to God and to their situation. It's connecting the timeless truth revealed by God with all of the ever-changing issues of our world. So let me summarize the main points. Theology is a thoughtful faith put into practice. It's receiving the truth from God and using it in the most faithful, appropriate way in all of life. Okay? So what? What now? Well, let me summarize a couple takeaway points and what you can do with them. First, think about God and all that He has told us about life, the universe, and everything. Second, conform your thoughts to God's revelation. Change your mind to be like His. Third, think about God more highly than yourself. Look at every situation with God as your reference point. See every part of your life through His eyes and find out how He is Lord in every situation. And finally, connect your thoughts of God to how you live your life every day of the week. Okay? Our next video is going to address the question, why then should we do theology? Thanks for watching.